panel, as has been said before, addresses what is perhaps one of the most fascinating, up-to-date, cutting-edge, topical issues of German public discourse, at least in the last 10 years. And that is the question of German identity and the issue of German patriotism in the era of the European Union. I would like to begin by saying that the issue we are addressing tonight is first and foremost a German issue, and this is not self-evident here in this country, in this city, to this audience. We shall obviously be addressing it here tonight also from an Israeli perspective, indeed from several Israeli perspectives. But part of my fascination with tonight's topic is the fact that this is a German issue first and foremost, not always comfortably aired in the presence of Israelis. And I, for one, would like to make absolutely sure that our guests here, our panelists, people from the audience, if they join the discussion, would feel perfectly comfortable addressing the issues of German national identity and consciousness today within or without the Israeli prism. To be honest, the topic is interesting enough in itself. But obviously, the Israeli prism, the Jewish prism, will enter via different routes into our discussions. In the year 1969, the then president of Germany, Gustav Heinemann, gave what I imagine was a very deep sigh, and then he said, and I'll translate into English, "There are difficult fatherlands. One of these is Germany." Incidentally, another one, Herr Lippmann, is Israel. 35 years later, President Horst Kohler, recently elected as the new president of Germany, said something different, not with a deep sigh. He said, "I love our country. Ich liebe unser Land." Why should such a simple statement, a simple sentence, grammatically and content-wise, be so difficult, so heavy, so pregnant with meaning in a nation's public discourse? And it still is. And yet, there is a strong and growing sense that the current German debate into national identity, national consciousness, national pride, patriotism, is opening up, is breathing less heavily today. Angela Merkel, not quite a woman of great quotable statements, but she also contributed her part to the current discourse of German identity when she voiced in public her support, quite recently, for the opening of a center commemorating the 15 million displaced Germans and ethnic Germans of the Second World War. And Merkel said that honoring their memory does not entail the rewriting of history, and yet it is part, she said, of our German identity. There is a German identity, or identities. They are alive and kicking today. They have shifted deeply in the era of the European Union and the particularly powerful German membership in the European Union over the years, and yet German issues are still German issues, fascinatingly so. Some people in Germany speak one of those terms that are a little difficult to translate into any other language, of the Unbefangenheit, which in English would be, the lightest, easiest translation I have found is unencumberedness. אני מבקשת סליחה. And in Hebrew, much more elegantly, חוסר מועקה, or שחרור ממועקה. A new Unbefangenheit in Germany is dealing with its identity, with its nationhood, with its past. Is this the case? If so, what vistas does it open? What horizons does it open for current German public debate? How is this new kind of unencumbered national consciousness affect debates between right and left, between European-oriented and not so European-oriented, between people who are taking part in their nation's past in different ways? All these questions to this panel, to this audience, are fascinating, even before we approach the no less fascinating Israeli gaze and perspective on this German debate, not to speak of the Israeli equivalents or far equivalents to this German debate, all of which I hope, or much of which, we shall address tonight. And so without further ado, I'm going to call upon, and we will go by the published order of speakers, and it is my honor and personal pleasure to invite Ambassador Shimon Shtein. Shimon has just returned to Israel from a 7 years sojourn as the Israeli ambassador to Berlin. Indeed, if I'm not totally mistaken, the first Israeli ambassador to Berlin began in 2001. Shimon's arrival in Berlin capped a long and distinguished diplomatic career in service of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. He worked in several other countries, including Washington, D.C. He conducted a great deal of research and director roles for the Israeli Foreign Office, a great deal of experience. But I think the 7 years of Shimon's sojourn as ambassador to Berlin have been most significant, certainly in the context of current Israeli-German dialogue. His contribution in writing, in speaking, in conversing has been tremendous. I am not sure it is known enough to many Israelis as it should be. And for me personally, I would like to add, if I may, and I will take the permission, that in a line of impressive, excellent, and profound Israeli ambassadors to Germany from the very beginning in 1966, Shimon Shtein is definitely one, and not the least, of that line. So it is my pleasure and honor to invite Shimon Shtein at the podium.
Pania has raised a number of issues, questions that I'm afraid that I will not be able to touch upon all of them. I will confine myself to making a number of observations which have to do more with the almost 7 years that I had the pleasure to be Israel's ambassador, the first ambassador to Berlin. Those 7 years, the focus of my duty there were primarily promoting Israeli-German relationship, and whatever has to do with a German issue, I'm only an observer, so that with that in mind, I'll allow myself to make a few observations, some of which have already been briefly addressed by Pania. It is, as a matter of fact, my second posting to Germany. The first one was in the 80s, beginning of the 80s. And I think that I mention it because I think that the three issues that are at hand and subject for discussion this evening, identity, patriotism, in the era of in the era of the European Union or European unification, each and every one of those issues are an issue in and of itself, and one can dwell on each and every issue as distinct from the rest. But I would, for one, speaking as an observer in the 80s and the beginning of this century, say that the issue of German identity is a subject that has already been discussed since any number of years. I can remember during the 80s that was part of also intellectual discourse. Professor Werner Weidenfeld, who is also known here, has spent a lot in also doing research, and there is quite an extensive bibliography which expands on the issue of German identity. The issue of German patriotism is an issue that I think that 10, 15, 20 years ago were unheard of. It belongs to a number of issues that were taboo, that were not dealt with, at least publicly. And I cannot recall that such a statement which Pania was quoting President Köhler, let alone Chancellor Merkel and her predecessor, that one could have heard a chancellor 20 years ago say that he loves his fatherland, or other expressions which one has been witnessed in the 7 years that I have been to. When I speak about the 80s and the 90s, I think that it is relevant in terms of the question of the German identity. And I would say that the main project associated with Chancellor Helmut Kohl, which was the project of European unification, his major effort was in a way to Europeanize Germany. In other words, to move from a German identity in Germany towards a European identity in Germany. And the reasons were quite clear, because speaking about German identity is a loaded term, and during the 80s, I guess the Germans were constrained and befangen, if I take the term that Pania has just brought up, so that his main project was to turn Germany more European, thereby also trying to Europeanize the whole notion of German identity. Moving from Chancellor Kohl era, primarily, although he came into power in '82, during the 90s, I think that the watershed in moving from that notion, as far as I'm concerned, is associated with the social democracy, Democratic Party and Green Party coming into power at the very last 2 years of the last century and the beginning of this century. Coming to power with the unification of Germany brought into the public discourse a certain Unbefangenheit, and I have not looked, I looked in the dictionary, and I will use the term lack of inhibition as far as the German discourse is concerned. So you can find the German becoming a bit more assertive. The Chancellor Gerhard Schröder certainly is somebody who embodies this new self-assertiveness, speaking about German interest, speaking about the German way. All of us will remember the way that Chancellor Schröder chose to go about during the months leading, or the days leading to the Iraqi war. So what we see in the German discourse nowadays is a growing self-assertiveness, is a willingness and openness to discuss issues that were unheard of years ago. And so we find ourselves today in Germany, though the issue framed today is in the era of European Union, European unification, what I sense nowadays is more a sense of renationalizing the notion of being German, discussing more openly issues pertaining to German identity, heavily tied up with the German coming to terms with their own past. Issues of patriotism also is something that has and is being discussed in all walks of life, and I can give you any number of examples to reinforce the lack of inhibition that has become part of the German discourse nowadays. Speaking about the European Union and European unification, namely brings up the issue of the European identity and the issues to what extent one can speak today about what is at all European identity nowadays. I find it difficult to define because that is one of the issues that the Europeans themselves do not openly want to discuss as a subject. What is the European identity? Is it tied up, confined geographically? Is it an idea that has no borders? I think that the issue has become very acute and relevant apropos the whole notion of Turkey's membership in the European Union, which brought as a subtext the entire issue of who does belong to Europe and who doesn't belong to Europe. And therefore, the entire issue of European identity superseding national identities is, as far as I'm concerning, is very far. And right now, it seems that the Germans are focusing more on the issue of what does it mean to be a German? What does German identity means nowadays as we are moving away from the Second World War, as the third generation is trying to answer for itself certain questions that have also been with us but are getting a new meaning with that new generation 60 and more years away from the Second World War. So you have chosen an issue that I'm trying to convey to you the message that it's a very complex issue, and I think that the Germans are more willing and are doing it, are openly discussing it more than they have ever done it in the past. I think that, Panya, with those few observations, I will stop and let others contribute their share, and will be more than happy to then fill in next.
Next panelist and speaker is Mathias Matossek, who has for a long time been a journalist, a senior journalist with Der Spiegel. Indeed, Mr. Matossek's career as a journalist can only be defined as enviable by anyone with a touch on the topic, because if we take it backwards, and most of your journalistic years have been with Der Spiegel, it goes back to being the cultural editor of Der Spiegel, before that reporter, correspondent of Der Spiegel in London, before that New York and Rio de Janeiro, and even before that, providing the special coverage of the great landslide of 1989 to 91, from the fall of the wall to the unification of Germany, as a special reporter. Who can remain unenvious of this kind of journalistic career, and obviously the perspectives it brings with it? And many of the fruit of this career have appeared not just in articles and essays, but also in several books authored by Mr. Matossek, among them a book titled Die Vaterlose Gesellschaft, the Fatherless Society, and another book titled We, the Germans, on national consciousness. Mr. Matossek has taken active part in many of the debates that have salted and peppered German public sphere in the last 10 or 20 years. Among them, interestingly for me, the debate around Günter Grasse's new biographical revelations last year, a very prominent stance there, and many others. Perhaps I should mention that the subtitle of the book, We Germans, is Why the Others Could Yet Come to Like Us. Irresistible, and I invite Mr. Matossek to the podium.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very glad that you introduced the term love and emotion into the debate of patriotism. I think you cannot discuss it without that emotional impact, and I think the emotional wave of identification during the football championship 2 years ago was a watershed experience. All of a sudden, you could see young fathers, children, beautiful girls, all wrapped up in black, red, and yellow. A flag that was taboo, more or less, a couple of years ago. And so it was a joyous celebration of a national identity as well. In our own apartment, my wife decorated the apartment with all the participants, flags of participants of the World Championship. It looked like the UN. At the beginning, and it became, in the course of events, it became more and more black, red, and yellow. And after all, it looked like the Hambacher Fest at the finish. So it was a very emotional summer. And my book, We Germans, appeared 2 weeks ago, and some commentators in Germany who introduced the book to their viewers in television or to their readers called for a shrink, because I was stating that being proud of his own country is not a bad thing, and that was not a common sense among the intellectuals back then in Germany. Let me point out some. Let me give you an anecdote of what I mean with patriotism and the love of one's own country. Nothing stimulates the love of one's own land more than having to constantly defend it against cliches and disparaging comments. And I think you might understand what I'm talking about. So spending some time in England proved an excellent tonic for an unreliable patriot like me. There, taking potshots at Germans is not at all limited to the low-class hooligans the country's tabloid press sends into battle. Within 2 weeks of setting foot on the island, I attended an illustrious dinner party where I was seated next to the novelist A.S. Byatt. The tender lamb roast was served beneath portraits of 18th century nobles. I grew merry and lightheaded, and I toasted to my neighbor's health, and even though she stayed weirdly uncommunicative and dour. Suddenly she asked me what I thought about the European Constitution. I almost choked. I didn't know anyone who had cracked open Giscard's 1,000-page boulder of paper. Certainly I had not. So I murmured that surely if the European community of states wanted to agree on a few fundamental principles, that must be a good thing. This seemed a safe line. And what did she think of it? I was playing for time, tossing the ball lightly back into her court. She didn't look like she had given the Constitution much thought either. Her surprisingly crude hand, laden with glittering rings, hovered over a plate. You know, she said, we British don't need constitutions. We are the oldest democracy in the world. And then she added, for young nations like your Germans, constitutions might well be of any use. Her tone could not have been more nasal and disdainful. Essentially, she was saying, you are barbarians, you've only just put down your clubs, you are uncultivated, you need to wear bits and halters. The dinner, incidentally, was being held in honor of a German cultural foundation that had, a year earlier, awarded Lady Byatt a lucrative prize. She was the guest of honor. I heard myself say, in my country, Your Grace, a woman gained the right to vote much earlier than in yours, which makes sense when I look at you. I took a sip of water. And as for constitutions, I think your small rainy island with its filthy hospitals and derailed trains would profit from having a few rolls. Of course, I did not say that. It occurred to me much later, as always. At first, I was speechless. Was she right? Did we Germans really just creep out of the woods? In a hurry, I thought hard and made a list of all great Germans. We, heirs to the Romans, Arminius, Charlemagne, St. Boniface, Barbarossa, Gutenberg, Beethoven, Heine, Bonhoeffer, Lubitsch, Beckenbauer, Heidi Klum. I have to admit that I wasn't entirely sure about some of the candidates, but I was on the right track. My list didn't begin in 1945. It didn't begin with the great admission of guilt, although this great admission is the kick-off to every thought about German history. Instead, I invoked ancient history, the Middle Ages, and the early modern period, as is the done thing for an historian. But then, giving a second thought about, patriotism and pride, what distinguished by it from most German writers I know is simply that she spoke about what she was proud of instead of what she was ashamed about. She was proud of her country and its history, and it was a rock-solid pride that quite automatically involved denigrating another nation. I believe that a certain amount of national pride is healthy. It doesn't have to express itself by insulting others, as Bayard did, yet without pride, a nation is incapable of rising to the challenges of its own future. In his book, Gibt es überhaupt eine deutsche Geschichte? Is there such a thing as German history? Historian Hagen Schulze quotes a famous line by French theorist Ernest Renan, who said, "A nation lives by the idea of," quote, "having accomplished great things together in the past and wanting to achieve more with one another in the future." I assume that Renan did not include appalling war crimes in his definition of great things, but rather deeds that one can be proud of. A nation has to be able to gain assurance from its history to be able to shape its future. And I believe there are very many great deeds in German history. I myself, I belong to a generation that was brought up as internationalists or cosmopolitans. I was brought up with the idea that being German or being of German identity is something very negative, burdened by the past, and that we like to see ourselves as internationalists and cosmopolitans, and that was a fake second identity. So only in the past few years, there is a new generation coming up, being brought up, that dares to identify itself, not with a negative laundry list if they say it's typical German. I mean, if the British say it's typical British, something good is going to happen. Stiff upper lip, politeness, courage, and so on and so forth. If we say it's typical German, we thought of a great laundry list of negative things. And I think that is shifting a little bit. I think it's a healthy thing that is shifting. And let me make a point here, and let's discuss about emotion and pride a little bit later on. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mטוסק, since I also met Antonia Bayard in rather similar circumstances, and he was also rather slightly less than polite, I would like to make a general apology to the British nation and tell you that they too are rather young. One needn't quote Benjamin Disraeli on the matter in this room. So they will learn their manners. Our next speaker is Professor Wolfgang Wipermann of the Free University of Berlin, professor of modern history there, researcher and author of numerous books and articles. Professor Wipermann studied at Göttingen history, German studies, and political science. And his themes of research encompass very broad and very interesting fields, including the history of fascism and theories of fascism, the history of communism, the history of the student movements, and various others. Of his books, of course, one of the most well-known is The Racial State, published by Cambridge University Press in English and went through numerous editions. And more recently, again a book with the most wonderful title, which I'm yet to read and will read, The Germans and Their Dogs, Die Deutsche und ihre Hunde. This deals with German national consciousness, and for me I have to add here, Herr Wipermann, that since I once wrote a little book called Israelis and Their Dog in Berlin, the dog is definitely there. I think that we have many, many views to exchange, but this shall be done later on. So, Professor Wipermann, bitteschön.
Would be a good idea to talk about dogs and the mentality of Germans and the relationship of Germans and their dogs. And so far I would agree with respect to the relationship of the Berliners to their dogs. The authoritarian character is over. Now the Berliners are anarchists with respect to their dogs and what their dogs do, because they are free dogs. Okay, this is a good example, but I'm very terrified by the problem to explain what is German identity and then also patriotism. Oh my God, this is a very weites Feld, to quote Fontane, a very broad topic. And I will isolate it and concentrate on the question, what is German identity? What makes the Germans tick? And as a historian, I need primary sources. I need facts and not opinion, not only my opinion. And I chose to show and to find out what is German identity today, the Eva Hermann affair. Eva Hermann is a well-known and so far influential journalist and writer in German. She praised in September the family and women policy in the Third Reich, and in October, in a public talk show, Hitler's Autobahn, and criticized the taboos concerning the Third Reich. And she said, it is not allowed to speak loudly and frankly about the Nazi time. This arose a scandal. This was a media event and public discussions in TV and all papers. But not only the elites took part in the discussions, but the silent majority. The silent majority sent thousands of letters to the editor, to the TV stations and the papers. I analyzed 2,000 letters to the Bild-Zeitung. And then the discussion continued in blogs and internet, and I have a very rare and exceptional basis of primary sources concerning what the silent majority in Germany is thinking. And I'm just writing a book about it. It will come out next week. The title is Autobahn zum Mutterkreuz, Autobahn to Mother Cross, Historians' Controversy of the Silent Majority. And my now 7 points are based on this expertise, this analysis. 7 points. What is the identity of the Germans today? First point, the German identity of the present is the German past. Second point, not the past of the GDR. The Westies are not interested in it, and the Ossis are thinking that there was something good in this GDR and in the Third Reich too. Both regimes were good. Comparisons between GDR and Third Reich are a discourse of the elites in the West, and also series of totalitarianism as well are not accepted by the silent majority. Third point, the identity of today is, of course, the past of the Third Reich. This past is not past. It is still present. The Vergangenheit, die nicht vergehen will, my Dr. Vater Ernst Nolte said and claimed 20 years ago. So far, so good. Or, to quote our mayor, und das ist gut so, I mean, Wowereit, the mayor of Berlin, und das ist gut so. But the fourth point, the discussion about the Third Reich is a two-aber discussion. The first aber is, yes, Hitler was bad, because he lost the war and led his people into the catastrophe. But, you know, there was something good in the Third Reich. Families, women, jobs, no jobless, no criminality, and above all, the Autobahn. Now 25% of the Germans today agree, following the latest polls others more than 40%. The second aber is, yet the story with the Jews, die Sache mit den Juden, was not good, but Israel. The Palestinians are treated like the Jews in the Third Reich. The former victims are now perpetrators, the Jews. The Jews in Germany of today are too powerful, is meant the Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland. Incredible. The Jews in Germany, together with Israel and the international jury, Internationales Judentum, force us, the Germans, to pay reparation and to deal with the National Socialist past. Wiedergutmachung and Vergangenheitsbewältigung is Jewish. This is a qualitative analysis. I will come to the polls and the surveys. The Jews, this is a notion, still are vindictive, avaricious, and devilish. In other words, traditional and secondary anti-Semitism is widespread. Not only in the discussion, but following the Heidmeier survey, or Bielefeld survey, GMF, in German, gruppenbezogene Menschenfeindlichkeit in Deutschland. I can't translate this. Gruppenbezogene Menschenfeindlichkeit in Deutschland. A survey, a poll concerning anti-Semitism. Traditional anti-Semitism today more than 20%. Secondary anti-Semitism more than 40%. Secondary anti-Semitism means, to quote Svi Rex, the wonderful professor here, the Germans will never forgive us Auschwitz. Us is, of course, the Jews, you see. This is the secondary anti-Semitism, and I think it's necessary to use a new word, anti-Israel anti-Semitism. Anti-Israel anti-Semitism more than 50%. And this is a discussion, and also following the survey, and it's a very good survey, there's speaking of the extermination of the Palestinians and comparisons between Israel and the Third Reich. Incredible, terrible. The fifth point is that anti-Semitism in all these variants and admiration of Hitler's Autobahn must be seen in context. And this means that the Vergangenheitsbewältigung and the tackling of anti-Semitism is not as good as expected. That is the problem. The sixth point, the silent majority and the elite, not only the silent majority, and the elite on the left and on the right believe in the existence of conspiracies, especially conspiracy of the Jews, Verschwörungsgläubig. This inflation of ideologies of conspiracies, and especially in the internet and in combination with anti-Semitism, we have a combination of the old conspiracy ideology of the protocols of the L of Zion, and now the Twin Towers conspiracy, CIA and Mossad. Seventh point, conservative attempts, this against Mattis. Conservative attempts to renew conservatism in Germany failed and must fail because conservatism and fascism are not separated but still connected. Maybe this is wrong and a pity, but the conservatives are responsible for that because they never have apologized for the alliance of fascism and conservatism in the past. Therefore, their dissociation from fascism is not believable and not understood by the silent majority. The call for conservative virtues, like family and fatherland, is, in my opinion, a dangerous dead end on the one hand and not necessary on the other. We don't need that. Several very bad remarks. I must end with a good one. And the sentence is, not all is bad in today's Germany's. We don't have the Führer anymore and still have the Autobahn. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, Professor Wiperman. I cannot wait for the second round. If I remember correctly, you were sitting on a panel with Daniel Goldhagen back in 1996, I think, at the Jewish Community Center in Berlin, and you praised Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, which became a theme of a great national identity controversy in Germany at the time. And you said that Goldhagen's book, if I'm quoting correctly, if not you shall amend me, is preventing the renationalization of Germany, at least for a while. It seemed that that prevention didn't work very long, and part of the questions that at least I'm tempted to put to you, Herr Wipermann, is whether what you are describing is at all preventable at this stage. Our last panelist in this round is Eldad Beck, correspondent, German correspondent for Yediot Ahronot in Berlin since 2002. Before that, he's had a long and interesting journalistic career, also an academic career, a graduate of the Sorbonne Paris 4 University in Paris, with a diploma in Arab studies, and has worked for the Israeli Army Radio, Galei Tzahal, and many other media outlets in Israel and also abroad. Eldad was born in Haifa, by the way, nachon, as was my colleague Gilad Margalit. So Haifa is quite a producer of excellent German-speaking, Germanistic-oriented young people in this generation in Israel, and that is another little point that Haifa can be wholeheartedly proud of. Eldad, bevakasha.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the kind words. Indeed, it is great to be home in Haifa, and I think that there is only in Haifa that one can understand how right is Chancellor Merkel when she says that the displaced persons are part of the German identity. It is hardly possible to walk in the streets of this city saying anything nasty in German without getting remarks from the passing persons. And I'm very glad, Matthias Mטוסק, that you have mentioned Heine in the long list of the great Germans. Since somebody who grew up in the Heinrich Heine Straße about 15 minutes from here, I just have to note that the debate, if one can name places in Germany after Heine, started long before a street in Haifa was called after this not so 100% Jewish great poet. I would like to put two big question marks on the title of tonight, and I will do it as an observer. I'm not only Israeli, I'm also, and that's bad luck for the Germans, Austrian. And the first big question mark would be on the issue of German identity. I'm not so sure that we should treat this issue in singular. Rather, we should do it in plural, and I shall explain to you later why. The big question mark, the second one which I would like to point out this evening, has to do with the EU, especially on this historical evening when the leaders of the EU states have signed in Lisbon a historical reform paper, document, whatever the name should be. Since I am not so optimistic about the future of the EU. Excuse me for spoiling the party. Quite on the contrary, I think that the EU, the framework of the EU, has reinforced in recent years a process of regionalization. And I think that if we look at what is happening right now in the country that is hosting the capital of Europe, Brussels, which means Belgium, you would understand what I'm meaning. The EU has brought to a situation where local, national, and ethnical identifications are being felt all over Europe much stronger than they have been before in countries that we are taking for granted, like France, like Spain, and any other country would be a very good example for that. I do not see any real identification among the peoples and nations of Europe with the idea of a European identity. Quite on the contrary, I think that the fact that the document which was signed today by the leaders of the EU would not be brought to a vote of the people is a very significant sign to the fact that the peoples might have not supported this paper. The Europeans, according to my long experience in this continent, and I've been in France, I've been in Austria, I've been in Germany for over 20 years, define themselves mostly against things and not for things. They are very, very anti-American. They are very often anti-Israeli, and may I add to that also anti-Semitic. They are more and more anti-Russian, and they are very politely anti-Muslims. They are only pro-something when this something is anti-something that they hate more than this something. And Germany, unfortunately, is no exception in this matter and also in the process of regionalization. Then I start telling them about my daily life with the Deutsche Telekom and with the Deutsche Bahn and with Lufthansa and so on and so forth. Believe me, what we think about the German identity is not only but also a German invention from certain times. Yes, the Germans are not only West and East, and until today, every year, during the day of reunification, there are polls that show that at least a fifth of the Germans would like to see the wall standing again. And by the way, if you speak to the East Germans and you tell them, you Aussies, they get it to their heart. They are very insulted, as somebody who was among the builders of the Frauenkirche in Dresden told me once. Oh no, we are not East Germany. We are Central Germany. East Germany we lost because of Hitler. Yes, they are not only West and East, they are also North and West. Imagine the day when somebody from Bavaria would become a chancellor. Only then maybe we would be able to speak about German identity in singular, and I'm not so sure that we would like to see this day come very soon. You also see Landpatriotismus, every state on its own, and you also see city patriotismus, because you have at least 3 cities in Germany that are states on their own, and they would do nothing to abandon this situation. So there is an artificial attempt against nature, I would say, to define a German identity, which doesn't really exist. There were 2 attempts to do it in the past, and unfortunately, they brought to 2 world wars. It's not that I'm afraid there is another one coming because of Germany. However, I would like to put your attention to some bothering, if not worrying, phenomenon that I have detected in Germany in the last years. First of all, let me introduce into the discussion a term that might shock some of you. However, I think that there is no replacement for it. In the years since the red-green government came into power, that was about 10 years ago, we have been witnessing the naissance of what I would call social nationalism in Germany that has developed recently, in recent years, in 2 venues. The first one is the established one. And I think Simon Shtein made a small reference to the German way, which was imagined by Chancellor Schröder and his good friends Putin and Chirac. I would start this social nationalism with the War of Kosovo, since it was the first time the Germans, since the end of the Second World War, sent troops for a war to fight. We can discuss the issue if this war was right or not. This would take us probably many more hours. However, we cannot deny the fact that it was a left government who did it, and ever since, they have been sending soldiers all over the world. Schröder also had some years ago the wonderful idea that German soldiers should be posted between us and the Palestinians. My God. Yes, the German way, which split into 2, Europe and the West before the Iraq war, was definitely a contribution of Mr. Schröder to what I call the social nationalism. I would also note my great astonishment to see that a social democrat, a German social democrat, called Putin a perfect democrat and was very angry when Angela Merkel met some activist of civil rights in Russia, not to mention the fact that he also criticized the fact that Mrs. Merkel met with the Dalai Lama. Social democracy in Germany is a very, very specific type of policies. And then, so that you will not think that I'm only anti-Schröder, there was the grasshopper campaign, the Heuschrecke campaign, which was started around the elections 2005 by the one who was the Secretary General of the SPD at the time, Mr. Müntefering, which described all those investors coming from abroad, buying German companies and then selling them at a better price and going somewhere else as grasshoppers, meaning taking out the sources of the German countries for themselves. Grasshoppers, Heuschrecken, was also a term which was used by the Nazis, and I find it very disturbing when the Social Democrats to this day use this term when they speak about investors from abroad. Not few of them are Jews. And there is the other one, the radical left, and this is much more of a problem when you think about the fact that Oscar Lafontaine, very openly during the last electoral campaign, has been using terms that the neo-Nazis use in their own campaign, and we see more and more some sort of mixture between this extreme left and the neo-Nazis. It's amazing to see that the neo-Nazis are demonstrating in the streets of Germany today with the Palestinian kafia and speak for green themes. They are very much concerned about the climate of the world. Yes, and I'm very worried because it seems to be that in the next elections that we will have, 2009, there are two scenarios which I'm horrified of. The first one is the return of the left, because if they will return, they will probably do it with the extreme left, and then we shall see a real revival of the social nationalism. And the second threat is that for the first time since the end of the war, there are very good chances that the neo-Nazis would be able to bring at least one deputy into the Bundestag. Yes, unfortunately, these issues are not discussed seriously by the German public opinion. They speak about sentences of Köhler, I loved my country, give me a break. Why should this be a theme for a public discussion? Or the ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous discussion that went in Germany during the World Cup about putting out a flag. Come on, these are not the real issues. These are just minor things. As long as the Germans would not treat openly with the real issues, and one of them is the immigration, they would not come to any solution about a possible future Germany identity. And by the way, I'm not so sure that we need such an identity. We need German identities. I was sitting in a plane some weeks ago going to an Asian country, reading an article of Die Zeit next to somebody who all of a sudden came to me and said, oh, how interesting that we two Germans sit together going to this country and you read this newspaper. My neighbor was a Turkish guy. He defines himself as a German. And this, I believe, is the future of Germany. The acceptance and the recognition of the multitude and richness of the German society as creating a multitude identity of many identities. Thank you very much.
I told you we shall not have a dull moment here, because look what we have now. We are going to have a second round, 4 gentlemen. It's going to be very interesting, because here we have Mr. Mטוסק talking about a Kulturdeutsch national identity that can easily link to the sweetest memories of the Yekes. And we have Mr. Wiperman, who is talking about a totally different kind of national consciousness which can easily link to the worst nightmares of present-day Israelis. And we have Mr. Shtein talking about complexity, and rightly so. The issues are increasingly complex today and out in the open. And we have Mr. Beck here, both a great Eurosceptic who doesn't augur well for the European Union, doesn't augur well for the German Republic, and is reasserting a new Kleinstaaterei. Very interesting stuff around the table. Gentlemen, I am now inviting you to a second round, which will have to be, again, quite short. Again, 5, not more, and this time I shall be tough, minutes for each to address the others. Now, in Germany, usually controversies either begin or end as scandals. Over here, I would like us to keep our controversy just on the edge of scandal, but not quite into it, if we may. So we shall do it by the same order. Shimon Shtein, please, would you be the first?
Since I've taken a leave of absence from my ministry, I feel a bit less restrained to stick to the official line. And only in passing, Eldad, referring to the decision taken by the Germans to deploy troops worldwide and the watershed, I guess, decision taken by the Green Social Democrat coalition to de-ideologize the question of deploying, of using military means and being a part of that is a sea change in Germany post-World War, which, by the way, and coming back to the deployment, apropos the deployment of German troops to Lebanon, between you and me and the privacy of this room, it was in an interview where our Prime Minister Olmert has asked the Germans to deploy forces to the Middle East. I guess they were very much restrained, because had you asked me 5 years, 4 years, 3 years before Prime Minister Olmert has, in an interview publicly in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, asked the Chancellor to send troops, responding to a question, I have always said that I cannot believe that in my lifetime, or at least in the life of my mother, we will see German soldiers being deployed in the Middle East because of reasons that I don't have to go into it. So when Eldad has painted a picture, and there is some truth to the picture that he has painted, sitting there, I wonder whether you would have heard from a Belgium, a Dutch, and other neighboring countries description the way Eldad has described the German society nowadays. We are very worried, because coming back to the question of German identity, I still, after the three panelists have made their observations, I still don't understand what a German identity means. And as a matter of fact, Eldad is right when he speaks about multiple identities, but there must be something in common for the one citizen in Hamburg and the other one which lives in Munich. And I guess if one looks into the question what defines identity, so one will come up with some things which are similar to us Israelis in a way, but not only, to every other nation. When it comes to the question of what is Belgium, well, I don't want to speak about Belgium because it's an artificial creature in a way, and I don't know whether the days of Belgium is numbered as we all follow the news, but after all, identity is language, and there is one language which is being spoken, albeit with dialects all over. There is a common history in a way. There is a common history. There is a geography, and there is what we call a Schicksal, which is also a fate. That is to say that I think that what we have heard now, and I was a bit surprised by Professor Wiperman, perhaps not surprised. Did you want to tell us that the anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism is part of the German identity nowadays? Yes. Well, that's quite a very... Well, so it's a very telling observation, because at the end of the day, what we are dealing now, we are reducing the German identity to those 12 years. And the question is, how will Germans in the future, as part of their discussion of their identity, will come to terms with those 12 years? And we Israelis and Jews are a bit afraid about the, in effect, Mr. Mטוסק, the shifting nature of the public discourse. And in a way, it was very easy for Mטוסק, Manfred, to speak about patriotism and him being a cosmopolitan, because his generation could not openly discuss the question of German identity, who we are, what is German patriotism, because it was a taboo. But that was a long time ago, and I guess nowadays he feels much more free to consider himself no longer as a cosmopolitan, but as a German, discussing that issue freely, because many of the taboos that were with the Germans until the unification are gone, and we find ourselves now in a new public discourse, and the nature of which and how will it end. I think that identity is a permanent issue which is being conducted in a context, and therefore speaking about identity in 2007 is one thing, and if we will meet in 7 years from now, we will speak differently about that identity. By the way, the Israeli identity is also as complex, perhaps not as, but is also complex, and if we have devoted an evening to discussing Israeli identity, I'm sure that we would have found here many speaking about an issue with different emphasis on what they consider to be an Israeli identity. I had also some other remarks, but because I got here a reminder that my time is up, so I'll finish here.
First of all, the question of identity is an age-old question. Already Friedrich Nietzsche said that the question for identity is the core question of Germans. Nevertheless, I think that the question of identity is bothering a lot of nations these days under the circumstances of globalization. You have a best-selling book in America, Who Are We? You have Gordon Brown's speeches about what is Britishness. You have the effort of the Danish to provide with a catalog and the cultural canon of what it means to be Danish. So the question of identity is not a German question at all, but a very common question. I was very, very, very challenged by the two speakers after me, who provided me with the Germany I don't know. They provide me with a dungeon, with a freak fantasy of old leftist ideas of Germany being crypto-fascist all the time, of even using the term grasshopper as a coded crypto-fascist language. All this obsession with, and not founded by statistics and numbers, not at all founded. Fears of a German being anti-Semitic is a core problem, or was a core problem in the German discourse in the last 30 years. And let me put it this way: before the football championship, the World Soccer Championship started, people like Wiperman and others warned the world community, or you don't go to be careful if you come to Germany. For all foreigners, Germany is a tricky situation for foreigners, even for especially for dark-skinned or Jewish or whatever visitors. And they are very violent, and they are anti-Semitic and hate crimes and so on. And nothing happened during the 3 or 4 weeks, much to the disdain of the people whose profession, or who live on their warning against such things. It's a fantasy country. Those two gentlemen provided me with. I have completely different experiences. In my book, I have the fantasy of sending Heinrich Heine through modern-day Berlin, and I think Heinrich Heine would be very, very comfortable living in Germany these days, in a peaceful, very big, economically not so powerful, but rather powerful nation, which is very tolerant. If you look at the statistics of hate crimes in England, France, Netherlands, and other European countries, Germany is ranking very much at the lower end. You have much more hate crimes in England, much more, and you have much more anti-Semitic crimes in France. So the statistics you are fingering there that aren't helpful at all. And let me conclude by some remarks on the side of Mr. Wiperman. He said conservatives are not in high regard in Germany because they never apologize for fascism. I don't know who you're talking about. one of the leading conservative minds in Germany, who happened to be a friend of mine, was Joachim Fest, who died a year ago. And he was a very, very cultivated conservative thinker. And he wrote the fundamental work on fascism and on Hitler and his family. And he brought out 4 weeks before he died his memoir entitled I Not, Ich Nicht. It was a Catholic conservative family who didn't march along with the fascists. And his record of his own biography is a very, very gripping and a very intense tale of telling of a conservative mind who never went along and, of course, never even came close of apologizing fascism. So I don't know who you're talking about if you talk about the conservatives. By the way, I think 2/3 of the German regional areas are conservative these days. But anyway, let me conclude by stating that I am very, very glad that this rather increasingly more small clique of intellectuals, leftist intellectuals, who try to paint that horrifying picture of a crypto-fascist Germany, that they're losing their grip, and new discussion and new fair discourse in Germany is re-emerging. Thank you very much.
I still believe in the old leftist ideas. Absolutely. Absolutely. We shall overcome, and 68 is not over. The old leftist ideas are not old-fashioned. They are very interesting and necessary. Of course, Mr. Matossek, I am not against black, red, golden. By the way, it's really golden. You should accept this. That means I am an admirer of the democratic tradition. My own great-great-grandfather was a member of parliament in the Paulskirche, the first German parliament. But the question is, of course, who knows German parliament in 1848? The silent majority, of course, not. Second remark, Mr. Mattes, what is your history lesson? Conservatives and fascists made a coalition on January 30th, and the conservatives were the majority in this government. It was not Hitler government only, it was Hugenberg and other conservatives. And the problem is, they can, of course, make a distance that, yes, it was bad. We made this coalition. We agreed to the anti-Semitic, nationalistic, anti-communistic goals and intention of the fascist regime. But they never did, and this is the problem. They should say, apologize. No, never again. We made a mistake, but they didn't. And it is not speculation. There are facts. I brought facts. The analysis of the silent majority of thousands of letters to the editor, the discussion in internet, in the blogs, and so on, and the polls. You cannot deny the results of the surveys and the polls. And there is at least 20% anti-Semitism, and more than 40%, and anti-Israelism more than 50%. We have a problem with anti-Semitism, absolutely. You cannot deny it. It is fine to say, yes, the football Weltmeisterschaft was fine, black, red, golden flags, and so on. And of course, I praise the visitors, and of course, not what you said, this is fantasy, but it is a dangerous situation. And if you look in special regions of Germany as foreign, whatever that means, there is still a dangerous place. And this is not mentioned the so-called German nose, the Jewish nose, excuse me, you see. And Ambassador Stein, it is the third point, anti-Semitism indeed is a constituent part of German identity of today. Absolutely clear, absolutely clear. And it is no wonder anti-Semitism was from the beginning part of German patriotism. Read the first German nationalist, Ernst Mozart, Fichte, Saul Ascher against Fichte, then Thronvater Jan, all were anti-Semites. And the invention of German nation was connected with the modernization and radicalization of anti-Semitism. They needed the devil. The secular is devil. They needed the enemy. We are the good. They are the bad. Also the German Jews.
It was the anti-Napoleon drawn to create a nation, not anti-Semitism. What is ludicrous?
Please don't forget,
it is ludicrous. The whole nation-building process was an anti-Napoleon, anti-French
anti-Semitic.
Not at all.
They not only burned French symbols, the students in 1817 on the Wartburg, but they also burned books of Jews and, quote, Heinrich Heine, wo man Bücher verbrennt, da wird man dereinst auch Menschen verbrennen, and this followed, you see. Last remark to Mr. Beck, I don't agree with you that the danger is on the radical left. I'm not in favor of Mr. Lafontaine and others, you see, but I think anti-Semitism traditionally is in Germany more on the right than on the left. I'm at the end, you see. And the last remark is with kefir. You can find only few kefirs now in Berlin. It is out. Kefir, the Palituch, yes, Palästinensertuch, is out. And it worked. What worked? I asked them in the TV, ist dir kalt oder bist du Antisemit? Are you cold or are you anti-Semit? Those guys who had the kefir. And it worked. Believe me, you see, it worked. Now it is, so far it's over. No kefir more, you see.
Mr. Mטוסק, I thank you very much for your remarks, since through it you have brought into light exactly what I was saying. We live in the same Germany, I believe that we live in the same city, and we see two different realities. German is very, very multiple, and this is good so. And concerning the kafir, the Palestinian kafirs, I'm taking upon myself now to document every kafir that I see in the city. I hope that your internet, that your email address would be has enough place to get all my photos. But you see, we see the same reality in two different ways. Also, my vision of Mr. Joachim Fest is not exactly the one of Mr. Mטוסק. I believe that he was the one who rehabilitated the Nazi and collaborator Mr. Speer, who always pretended not to have known about the Holocaust until very recently. We have found, not we, I mean, people have found documents that have shown that he knew all along what was happening and was taking profit of it. And I think that if you read the memories of Mr. Reich-Ranitzky, you will see how very unorthodox conservative this Mr. Joachim Fest really was. And by the way, as I was interviewing some years ago, Mr. Afrik Simon, maybe you remember him, he was a great singer in the 80s. Yeah, he told me that he's an African that has been living now for 35 years in Germany, in Berlin, doesn't have the guts to go to East Berlin because he knows what's waiting for him there. So I suppose maybe it would be also a good story for Der Spiegel that we will go together to these no-go areas, and each one of us will probably see there different things. Thank you.